Have you ever felt like your parable story is just always ongoing? Welcome back to the Parable Podcast. And if this is your first time listening, welcome. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Joining me today is Executive Director of Olivet Media Group and Associate Professor Brian Nutter. He shares about the ongoing parable story of parenting his son.
Is he going to be whole in the terms of what we think whole is mentally on this earth? No, he's not. Because you have dreams for your kids, right? You say, I'm going to provide for my kid and I'm going to give them every opportunity imaginable so they can do whatever they want. I had to let those dreams go a long time ago.
Here's my conversation with Brian Nutter. You know, it's always funny when we get to connect with different people. So my guest today, I found him through his uncle at a volleyball game. Okay. And so I'm excited to meet him and also to introduce Brian Nutter to you. Brian, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I know it's a weird connection, but it's good to be here.
You know what? God works in mysterious ways, even through volleyball matches. Your Uncle David and I mean, we spent many a time during the season, like sitting with each other. So eventually, I mean, why wouldn't you find guests for your podcast? Brian, you are the director of the World Mission Broadcast and the executive director of Olivet Media Group and an associate professor. So just a couple things going on in your professional life.
I am very busy.
So have you always kind of like had that drive to have multiple things going in your life? Or you're just like, you know what, these are all my different passions. Like, I just feel like I want to do this.
You know, I think that passion is a huge part of it. A calling is a huge part of it. And when it's ministry, I have a really hard time saying no.
Yeah.
You know, I love being a professor. I love teaching. I'm a builder by nature. So my grandfather, when he retired, was a clockmaker, built clocks, had a carpentry shop. And so I love to make sawdust myself. But what I get every fall is a new crop of building materials and new students.
Yeah.
And for 4 years, I get to pour into them and to build something out of them. And so I love that. My passion has always been media. I tell people I started in media when I was 9 years old. It was media distribution. I had an afternoon newspaper route. But my mother was the production manager at that newspaper, so I was always close to it. And so when I was actually able to have a job at like 15, they taught me photography and how to develop pictures in a dark room with chemicals, the old way of doing it, and then how to write. And so I was a sports reporter. I did a monthly column in high school. And so I thought I was going to study journalism. And then God has other plans, of course. And my senior year of high school, I took a media class, which exposed me to video work. And the high school band teacher was also the morning show guy at the local radio station. So everyone knew him, and he's kind of this crazy guy anyway. But the radio station had auditions, and he came into the class and said, hey, if anyone's interested, Saturday, come down. So a bunch of us did, and I stumbled over the word precipitation. I could not pronounce it to save my life. I finally just gave up, said, you know what, Friday it's going to rain. And they wanted to hire me. I was 2 months from graduating from high school, and I'm like, I'm only going to be here 2 more months. I'm going to college. I'm not going to stay in this little tiny town and do local radio. But it put something in me. And so I switched from journalism to broadcast communications. And from that, got a call, a missions call, where God was really telling me, you can do what you love, which is the broadcast media kind of thing, and go overseas and kind of teach people how to do that. And so my family and I were able to do that. We spent many years in South America. I ran a communications center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I built another center near Sao Paulo, Brazil, for Portuguese language. And then we had our major indigenous languages of South America, which are Quechua, Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani. There's a test later, so take notes. So we did that. And then I did what all great missionaries are supposed to do. Work yourself out of a job. Bring up national leaders. And then turn the ministry over to them. And so I did that. And then they called me back to the U.S. and they said, hey, lead this to the rest of the world. Light a fire. And so during those years, I developed a new strategy in Africa, built a studio in Papua New Guinea, started Arabic television from Beirut, Lebanon. So I've been, starting in newspaper, radio, audio is my passion, but also producing television and producing film. It's all about content and how we distribute it. And so great, compelling content that connects to people and points them to Jesus is what my life is all about.
There was an article that someone wrote about you, but you said within the first 6 seconds is how you capture the audience. And I think that is so true. And just kind of like what you were even saying with precipitation, like that is the authenticity, the engagement that a listener desires. Like they are looking for something that is real, not perfect, and that can come throughout so many different types of content. I love that you have a background, or that you are currently still in radio. My husband is in radio. That's how we met, in radio. What are you most looking forward to as, you continue being a professor in radio and all these different types of content creation?
When students sign up for the multimedia communications degree, there's multiple concentrations they can focus on. And but all of them have to take my Fundamentals of Broadcasting class. Okay. And so I have people in there that want to do film. I have people in there that want to do television and video. And you ask an 18-year-old today, hey, do you want to study radio? They're like, what's that? You know? And so when they get into my class, I tell them that the audio world is unique and special. Yeah. And this is why radio and podcasting are so connective, is because, again, the professor coming out of me, the neurological parts of the brain, when it's just audio and you don't have the visual representation, that triggers a part of the brain that creates this deeper emotional connection to the person listening to it. So they have to create those images, and that's in a different part of the brain when the images are already provided. Yeah. And so that's why I love it so much. And you're so right in the fact that people today want authenticity. They want real. They want to be connected to people. Way before COVID, our society is in a loneliness epidemic. Yeah. And we heard over and over again from people during the lockdown of COVID how our radio ministry was their lifeline. They were alone. They were wondering, why do I even continue to go on? Yeah. And to be that voice on the other side, and that connectivity, and 6 seconds, and obviously you've been peeking in my class, I think, but I tell students, 6 seconds, a goldfish has an attention span longer than humans do today. And 6 seconds, I think, for even Gen Z today is too long. Yeah. Because it takes them 1.5 seconds to flip from that TikTok to the next saying, I'm not interested, not interested. And so that's how quickly their attention span is. Yeah.
We have an 11 and 14-year-old, and I just think about our attention spans here in the home, and gosh, that's so true. I'd also love to know, Brian, what sparked that heart for missions? What in you stirred that you said, like, I want to go beyond these four walls in America?
Okay, so that's a great story. I'd finished college. I was engaged to my wife, and I had interviewed at numerous different record companies and radio stations and different things. And I just did not feel that they were the right thing for me. Sure. And so, and God does this. When he calls us to something, he'll put out breadcrumbs. Yeah. He doesn't make the whole picture clear, but I just felt impressed that I needed to prepare for ministry. And I know I wasn't called to be a pastor. I just studied broadcast communications. Why would you want me to be a pastor? And so I told my wife, I'm like, listen, I think we need, when we get married, we need to move and attend seminary and prepare for ministry, but I have no idea what that looks like. And she's like, okay, So we did that. We moved to Kansas City after we were married and enrolled in a seminary there. And the seminary has this big picnic that happens before the school year starts. So the new students can meet the other students and the faculty. And we met one of the missions professor there. His name is Chuck Gailey. He was a missionary forever in Swaziland, now called Eswatini in Africa. So he's learning my backgrounds in radio and broadcast. He's like, oh, well, that now that communism has fallen and the USSR is no longer, the church is now able to get into Russia, and the church has acquired a building. It was an old school building in Moscow, and that's where they're going to plant the very first church. And it's multiple stories, and on one of the stories, they're going to build a studio, and they're going to produce Russian radio programs. Wow. And I describe it as like the Holy Spirit shoving the back. Yeah. So it's like, all right, this is it. Boom, push, you're into it. And so I studied missions at the seminary. And man, I tell you what, even being in the United States and working where I'm working and serving where I'm serving, missions is still a big part of what I do. So our radio network, we also have a global footprint. Yeah. So it's crazy. We have a vocational school in Malawi, Africa. We have 2 safe houses in Mumbai, India, that rescues girls that are born into the red light district. Moms are working there. We say, hey, you're coming, they want to send them out. They don't want them in that environment.
Yeah.
So when they turn 6 years old, they can come with us. And so they're in safe houses there. We have there's several, more than just the two that we sponsor, but there are several. The one we sponsor are girls that are 12 to 18. And when you go into the red light district, I was there last summer with the ministry, and you look into the eyes of these children that are around their mother's feet as toddlers, and you look into their eyes and they're empty.
Yeah.
They've been exposed to way too much. They've seen way too much. And so fortunately, mom realizes that. Mom doesn't think she has any other option but to do this work. But that ministry also has a center across the street from the red light district where this mom comes. They come for medical care and counseling. And if they choose, they can learn to do industrial sewing so they can have another career versus that. But they also are like, here, take my daughter. They're still in contact. They're still communicating. But by the time these girls are 18 and they're getting ready to go to university, they are completely different.
Yeah.
Joy emits from them. They know Jesus, no matter what faith background they came from. They speak fluent English.
Wow.
You know, they've gone through years of counseling, trauma counseling. All their medical care is taken care of. And then last year we had an issue as the ministry grew. They turned 18. Well, a lot of the moms who are still in the industry when they turn 18 are like, okay, now it's time to come work.
Yeah.
Because it's legal at 18. And so we're like, yeah, we got to figure out what we're going to do there. So we opened another safe house that's literally around the corner from the university. And we're saying, okay, you want to study a career in the university, here's the safe house, and we take care of their education as well.
Wow.
So we also work with another ministry called Medical Missions Outreach. They do medical teams all over the world. Their big need is, the use glasses that we have in the drawers of our houses?
Yes.
They need those.
Yeah.
And so now our radio network provides like almost 70% of the glasses that they use around the world. So there's a footprint there,
Yeah.
That's my heart. My heart is global.
My question to you is, how has this impacted your faith when you are able to see God at work globally? How has that helped you grow spiritually? How has it softened your heart to areas around the world that you were unfamiliar and you could be more empathetic to?
Yeah, your perspective quickly changes. I was fortunate enough to sit under the teaching of Chuck Gailey, in seminary, and to hear him talk about, we're not the great white hope. Going in there, we go in there to work alongside them and to realize that our way that we do it here in the U.S. is not necessarily the way they do it. So we have to be open to the way they do it.
Yeah.
And maybe showing them that, hey, what if you ever thought about this, and show them new ideas. But at the same time, we're not going in there. Anyone who serves in an overseas capacity doesn't go in there just to take over everything and make it look like the U.S. That's not it. The only culture that we're impacting is the spiritual part of their culture.
Yeah.
So it's definitely changed my perspective on poverty, homelessness. I've had a meal with a family whose house is built on top of the landfill. Their trash floor is there. We're outside around a fire built on top of a landfill. How dangerous is that? And, I ask, why do they live this way? Do they need a job? No, they have a job. Well, they have a house. Yeah, it's a house. It's a house they know. Well, why are they in this situation? And it all comes down to education, what their education level is. And a lot of times it's generational. So that's the way they exist. When you take that family and you take them out of the landfill and to a shopping mall they've never been to in their life, it's a different reality for them. So that changed my perspective dramatically on homelessness. Here in the U.S. we have lots of homelessness because we have lots of housing requirements. There, a house is made out of anything. Every major city in the world has that part of town. Great story I have. So I was actually going to film a video in Neuquén, Argentina, which is the very top of Patagonia. Everyone's heard of Patagonia. And we were going down there to film a video that was a forced video about a theme, and I know it wasn't going to work. I wanted to tell stories, and this wasn't a story. And so we get there, and the guy who was taking us around, because we bust in, was a police officer who was also studying to be a pastor. And so I heard his story, which was just unbelievable. Police, many parts of the world, they don't get paid very well, so that leads to corruption. He's seen unbelievable, horrific images during his career, people that are brutally murdered. He's had to experience that. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of alcohol and drugs with the police and the fact that they have to escape from what they see every day. And so his wife and his daughter, who's about 7 at the time, start attending church. And the 7-year-old daughter every week asks Dad, hey, come to church. Well, how can a dad say no all the time to a 7-year-old daughter? So he goes to church, and they've got the words up on the wall, and they're singing songs, and the song is something about how all the things that Jesus has done for my life and in my life. And he's thinking, well, what have I done for him? And so he has that moment right there in the service where he embraces Jesus and realizes he cannot continue to be a police officer, because in his police training, they train them, if you fire your gun, aim for the head or the heart.
Wow.
He said, I cannot send someone into eternity knowing where I'm sending them. So I can't fire this gun anymore. So he walks into his commander's office. He has his badge and he gun, and he lays it down. He says, I can't do this anymore. And of course, the commander, because he's been a great police officer for 20 years, he's like, now, hang on. I have a new assignment for you where you're not going to need to use your gun, they hope. But it's in that neighborhood that you find in every major city of the world. In Neuquén, it's called Las Tomas, which means to take. The people took the land, they built a little house on it. And so this neighborhood is 75,000 people.
Wow.
Of these little bitty huts, smaller than a typical office. They have a dirt floor. The bathroom is a bucket in the corner. There might be a mattress laying on the floor. They're made out of cardboard and tin and plastic. There might be a curtain for a door. And Neuquén's cold. This is Patagonia, right? And so Carlos is this police officer's name. He's taken us through this area, and it's amazing because there's not a lot of respect for police. Everyone in that community respects him. Everyone. And so we're driving along, and we pass this one guy who's out in his front little yard area in front of his little shack, and he says, hey, how you doing? And the guy responds to him, and Carlos says, hang on, something's not right. We got to stop. So we stop there, and we're talking to him, and this guy is like edgy. And so Carlos is like, hey, where's your wife? I want to say hi to your wife. Oh, well, she's inside. She's with the kids inside. She's like, well, let me just say hi to her. It's like, oh, no, she's busy. It's like, just let me say hi to her. Well, of course, then she comes out, and her face is red, and she'd been crying because he'd been slapping her around. And so domestic violence is what Carlos works with more in this neighborhood. And, of course, Carlos gets right into his face and says, you can't treat her like that. I could take you in right now for beating her, and then what would happen? You wouldn't be here to protect them. You wouldn't be here to provide for them. He says, you cannot do that, And so he didn't take him in. He calmed down the situation. He prayed for them, which that's not normal for a police officer to do. And then the next day we go back, and he's like, let's check on them. And so he checks on them, and of course they're doing much better.
Yeah.
But the reason why is she wanted to go get a job, and he did not want her to work because it's dangerous, he says, because, he's showing scars of knife wounds from where he's out trying to work. And when I say work, a lot of them are going to that landfill to recycle whatever they can find, and that's their job. And so that changes your perspective on what homelessness and poverty look like. If we were allowed people to build without building codes, and then we'd get some pretty strange looking houses, I'll tell you that, but at least they'd be under a roof.
Yeah.
So it definitely does that, just to know people's stories, know where people have come from. Oscar, so when I met Oscar, he was 13. And Oscar came from a family of 10 children, extreme poverty. He was born with a cleft palate that they couldn't get fixed. So it was hard to understand him. But Oscar was always around when we were doing film productions. And so he's always watching us. And so I said, hey, you want to learn how to do this? He's like, yeah. And so we started training Oscar on a camera. And, that was, 2002. So 22 years later, Oscar's married to a Brazilian woman. He's Argentine. They have 2 beautiful daughters. He continues to work for the church in videography. In my opinion, he has the best eye of anyone in the world. And that's just the grace of God putting people in your path and allowing you to pour yourselves into them, and then you see the results. Yeah. And the results are a rippling effect. And that's really what God wants us to do. He wants us to have a ripple effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, so many stories. I mean, it's so good to hear those. And I think when people share stories with me, that's where that connection point comes in. Even if I'm not able to experience it, it helps me better understand And that's how I learn. And I think that's why stories matter so much. So you have all these stories that you've shared, but I do want to hear about Brian. Like, what was the parable story for you that you want to share with us today?
So we live in the middle of a parable story. So we have two boys. Our oldest son, Jake, is married now. He lives in Tennessee. He works for a television network. And I told him not to do radio because he mumbles. But our youngest son, and I'll just call him M. And so we were foster care parents, and M was a placement. He came to us not quite 5 months old. His mother was 15 and in and out of foster care herself, generational drug addicts. And so M came to us, and he had one volume at the time, which was Explode, because of neglect. His grandmother, who was also a drug addict, was primarily the one taking care of him while mom was on the streets. So we took about a month to get him regulated where he knew we would respond with a normal baby whimper. But Michael was in our home and immediately fit with who we were, and we immediately fell in love with this kid. And so mom never cleaned up her act, and so parental rights were terminated. There was no biological father at all in the picture. And so we adopted Michael just shy of his second birthday. And we knew when you have foster care, when you have adopted kids, there is trauma there. There's always trauma. We just did not know the extent of the trauma and what he had experienced for the first 5 months of his life, and then also in vitro. Trauma is cellular. Most people don't realize that. And he was exposed to a lot of chemicals that mom was taking. So as he grew, he was always a big kid. He was off the growth charts very early. And it's about 5 years ago that school wasn't working for him. And so we had him in a private Christian school, and they weren't, of course, equipped to deal with the needs that he required. And so we put him back into public school. And of course, that was, then at that point, talking an educational plan. About five to 6 years ago now is when it really came to a head. And after years of therapists, psychiatrists, trying different medications, all kinds of testing, all kinds of diagnoses, he is on the autism spectrum, which is one thing of its own. But when you combine autism with trauma, it's very difficult to find the right treatment plan. It requires a team of people. And his psychiatrist at that time diagnosed my wife and I with PTSD and chronic stress.
Wow.
And told us, you've done everything you can. Everything you can. You've brought in specialists. You've taken him to me, to other therapists, all kinds of different therapies. He needs full-time therapy and care if we're going to help rewire his brain, if you will, because that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And that's the problem in society today, especially when adoptions, even international adoptions, because the first really 2 years of a child's life, the synapses of the brain are connecting. And to connect them properly, that baby needs to be loved and coddled, and so when there's neglect and trauma, they connect incorrectly.
Yeah.
And so when they connect incorrectly is when you have high brain function, emotional stability, all those things get affected. And so he was diagnosed with autism, oppositional defiance disorder, intermittent explosive disorder. It's not an official disorder yet, but it needs to be, and that's developmental trauma disorder. The professionals haven't stamped that as an official diagnosis, but it needs to be, because that does affect development. Definitely not physically.
Yeah.
So he is physically, he's 14 now. He looks 19. He's 6'2" and 264. He would destroy on the football field, but because of all this, he can't play football. Emotionally, he's 5. Right.
Wow.
And so what has happened through his life is, because of his size, even in like daycares, well, he's so big, we're going to move him up with the older kids.
Yeah.
Nightmare situation. And so resourcing is always an issue. We go to all kinds of meetings with schools, and the frustration for us is, you have all these professionals that are supposed to know the answers, and we know about more resources than they do. So we'll mention, what about this? And they're like, well, I've never heard of that. And we're just like, you're the professional. You're supposed to know this stuff. And so we have consultants now that work with us. My wife and I have been on a committee for our county. The county got a grant to develop a 360 system of care for mental health in our county. We're understaffed when it comes to therapists and psychiatrists for kids. My wife served on the executive committee for a time as well. So residential schools it's been a journey for him. The first school he was in was closed down by the state of Illinois. there was some physical abuse happening there, and they shut it down. So the state told us this ahead of time. We immediately got him out there. We got him into another school that we tried before, but didn't have openings. That school on the trauma side, we saw great progress because that was their focus, but they didn't know how to understand the autism side.
Yeah.
And so he was kicked out of there for extreme violence. Next school in a different state. I'm just gonna be honest with you. He attacked a kid, choked a kid to unconsciousness, and they arrested him, charged him with second-degree assault as a 12-year-old. And he spent 100 days in juvenile detention. We pled it down to third-degree assault. And then they released him to me so I could take him to a school in another state.
Yeah.
And in that school, he sent 2 more kids to the hospital. And by this time, my wife and I are looking coast to coast for schools. We have a spreadsheet of 84 schools that have told us, no, he's too violent. And so he was home with us and has a violent outburst, destroys the gear shift in my wife's car out of anger. Another fit soon after that one. I've gotten really proficient at patching drywall, just so you know, because he likes to punch walls. But he snapped an iPad in half. That tells you how strong he is in a fit of anger. And my wife and I, better than anyone else, we know his triggers. We know we can visibly see when he's getting escalated. We know when to step in and help him de-escalate, and we can get him to do it the quickest than anyone else because we know him better than anyone else. But at the same time, if it's already past that point of no return, that's when rage happens.
Yeah.
And because of his autism, for a long time, the only emotion he could show us was rage. So my wife and I, we were out of answers. We've been at the point of no answers many times in our life, and just say, God, you've got to open up a door. You've got to provide. You know, we dedicated him to God when he was a baby and said, he belongs to you. We put him in your hands, and we trust that you're going to guide him through this. And so we had to make a decision earlier this year when that last episode happened. One of the things that our consultants have talked to us a while when we do feel like our lives are in danger is to do a no-fault lockout. And trust me, the police have been in my house so many times. They all know us. They all know my son.
Yeah.
You know, some of them we go to church with, thank goodness. But we told the police, they said, listen, we have to do a no-fault lockout. And they were going to take him to the hospital, to the mental health ward. And we get to the hospital, and the hospital says, okay, we're going to admit him. We don't have any beds. We're going to call around. And we told them, they said, well, we're doing a no-fault lockout. And then we have what's called a SAS worker, which works with the social services side of things. We told them we're doing a no-fault lockout. So at that point, the way it's supposed to go is they contact DCFS because we know 83 schools have said no to us. We can't find another place. DCFS needs to step in and help us. Yeah. DCFS, of course, contacts us and says, you're just abandoning your child? You're horrible parents. Well, then we explain the whole story. Then they back off, right? But then they just stop communicating to us. And so the hospital is contacting us, and we're visiting our son in the ER now for 4 days. Yeah. In the ER because there's no beds. They don't want to admit him even if a bed opened. Because they don't know where he's going after that, and they don't want him there forever. Yeah. So it goes on for a few more days, and then they threaten police, and they call the police on us. Our friend, who's a sergeant, answers the phone and says, this is a DCFS issue. This isn't police. So then they call the state, and the state forces the police. So we are visiting our son in the hospital, and they arrest us for child abandonment. They handcuff us. They lead us through the ER. They put us in a cruiser. They take us to the detention center. They book us. I can see my wife in one cell. I'm in another cell overnight before our court case the next day. So needless to say, just fast forward, the grand jury said this is ridiculous, voted unanimously, dropped charges. You know, we're trying to get that all expunged from our record and sealed. And it's just because it never should have happened. Yeah. Never should have happened. And parents in this situation, and there are more parents in this situation than we actually know that are dealing with mental health issues with their kids. They can't find the answers. They're desperate in what they're trying to do because they call it child abandonment. I call it advocation. We were advocating for our child to get him the services he needs. You know, when we were fostering him and we had that meeting and we met his biological mom for the first time and biological grandmother, I left that meeting and I told my wife, if the state messes up and ever sends him back into that situation, I'm done. I can't do this anymore because he'll end up dead or in jail before he's 18. I want to make sure that we do everything we can to provide everything he needs to function in society. And I don't know if he fully will be able to do that. Yeah. And You feel like a failure as a parent. But someone told me if your child had a severe cardiological event, if they had a heart condition, you would want the best cardiologist to work with them, right?
Yeah.
Same situation. They have a severe medical issue, which is mental health. Not their fault. Not their fault at all, because it's really the chemicals that he was exposed to by his biological mother.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she was exposed to chemicals by her biological mother. It's generational. And there are more and more kids in that situation today. So what happens to parents is, one, they don't know where the resources are. So my wife and I have had to literally study and become experts in this field.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also isolate ourselves, which is the worst thing you can do. What can you control? You can control your child inside your bubble, your home. So you isolate yourself. You have to build a bigger community around you. You have to find advocates that are on your side, helping you find for answers and resources. And when those run out, in our situation, we had to do something desperate, but we won't give up. He's in a residential school today. It's not going well. There's not a pretty bow on this story. We fear for his life. We do. We're visiting him regularly. We're talking to him regularly. We want him to have the best care. We just haven't found what that is yet.
Yeah.
We just don't know what that is.
Brian, when I hear your story, I just think of unconditional love. Like, here's a child that was not your own flesh and blood, but you chose to love him, and not even knowing, like, you're just like, I don't know what is coming into our family. And here you are, like, many years later, continuing to fight and advocate, even while diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and just like trauma that you guys have been inflicted, just like constantly coming back. How do you, as a parent, when you feel like such a failure, like, how do you keep going? Just like you said, this is an ongoing thing you and your wife are going to continue to work through, to deal with for him, and you're going to continue to fight. Like, how do you keep going?
The notion of that you're a failure as a parent, you have to put aside.
Yeah.
You do. Because there's no rule book on this. There's no training manual on this.
Yeah.
Our oldest son, who is biological, great kid. Hey, we did great. We're great parents. But then kids are different. Even biological kids, siblings are different from each other, and you have to parent them differently.
Yeah.
And so just like when you have a surgeon, I can read all kinds of books and find all kinds of resources, but trust me, you don't want me doing surgery on you, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not failure. That's just the reality of me knowing my limitations. And we had to find out exactly where our limitations are and embrace the fact that, and this is tough for men.
Yeah.
Right? Men are fixers. There's a problem. We immediately want to find the solution and fix it. And so this has been really a struggle for me.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer.
Yeah.
And trust me, my therapist and I talk about this a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I know the ultimate answer is Jesus. And I know that somehow God is going to use our son in a way that only he knows. And is he going to be whole in the terms of what we think whole is mentally on this earth?
Yeah.
No, he's not. Because you have dreams for your kids, right?
Yeah.
You say, I'm going to provide for my kid and I'm going to give them every opportunity imaginable so they can do whatever they want. They can be whatever they want. I had to let those dreams go a long time ago. And I say, God, you work in his life to make sure that he does what you want him to do, how he can do that. And it's so tough. And in the mental health world is so tough because mental health is an invisible disability. In my house, we don't say special needs. We say special abilities. We look at the positive abilities. We look at the 90% of the time when our son is smart, funny, a great kid who wants to help out in any way he can. We don't look at the 10% of the time. It's much like the Incredible Hulk and Bruce Banner. 90% of the time he's Bruce Banner, then 10% of the time the Hulk happens. And much like the Incredible Hulk, after it's all said and done, he doesn't even remember it. And there's no emotional connection because of the autism, because of that, So just realizing that you can't be the superhero and have all the answers, especially the guys that are listening. As you know, as dad, we want to make sure that we're providing and making sure that every need is met. And sometimes we're basically having to give control of parenting over to a residential facility. And trust me, they don't parent like we do. There's no faith component to it. And that's principle for us. And that's hard. In many ways, if you know the story of John and Charles Wesley, they were from a large family, and their mother was a disciplinarian person. And she was just boom, 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 rules. Thus the reason why Methodism today, they got up at this time, they prayed for an hour, they read, that was the influence of mom. Well, during their childhood, they had a fire and their home was destroyed. And so they had to distribute the kids to different family members. And then when they all came back into the same house, of course, the parenting was different in the different households. And that frustrated Susanna Wesley. Kind of the same thing. I'm giving control over them to parent my kid. And it's not the way I want to. He's not getting that faith element every day that he would get in our home. I pray that the foundation that he was provided in, the first 9 years of his life in our house, that he still does it. He still, when we're together, we still pray together. So he understands that. But trust me, he does things that I can't even imagine he would be doing if he was in our house.
Yeah. Brian, I think a lot of us, we have like this tension of life, and it's mental, emotional. We don't even know what other people are carrying if we don't share our life with others. I think what I heard from your story is like there is so much community involvement, like there's people in your life that you can go to. I'd love for you to encourage anyone who's struggling with family members who are walking through isolation, because it's very easily to do that because there's shame that's involved, or just like total frustration, mental frustration, because I don't know how to deal with this, so I just have to do it on my own. How would you encourage somebody who's walking through that right now?
If faith is not a part of your life, it needs to be. Honestly, I don't know how anybody could go through any difficult situation in life and not have God to rely on as their source of strength. Realizing you need a group of people around you that can support you, that can advocate for you. Even here at the university, when we were released from jail, I had a text message waiting from the president saying, whatever you need, just picture me with my hand held up.
Yeah.
And so to know that we have that kind of support system, and that's work. You have to build that yourself. And another thing I would say is people are going to try to empathize with you. They're not going to be able to do that unless they live it.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, oh, well, my sister, she had, not the same thing.
Yes.
Right. Don't get frustrated with them. They just care.
Yeah.
But find people. There are ministries out there that have support for adoptive parents. There are Facebook groups you can get on, and you'll learn about new resources there, perhaps. So it does take a team to do this. You can't do it on your own. Don't isolate yourself. It's the worst possible thing you can do. That's why the faith component, being a part of a church that knows and cares and doesn't judge. Trust me, my wife and I are thrown in jail. You don't think that there were people like, they're horrible, and they don't know the situation.
Yeah.
And we did not have to defend ourselves. There were plenty of other people on social media that defended us, because they knew the story. Definitely, if you're not already, start seeing a therapist yourself. You can't carry this baggage. You need to unload. There's this thing in foster care called respite, and it's so vitally important to have respite from that situation. So self-care, big part of it. Team of people, faith at the center of all this. Know that you're not alone. There are other people out there who are dealing with situations. I've said numerous times in my life, there's got to be a worse situation with another kid that's struggling like this. There's got to be a worse situation. I haven't found it yet. And I hope it doesn't exist out there.
Yeah.
Because I could not imagine what those parents would be going through. But we could not be going through this without God at the center of it.
Yeah. Amen. Brian, something you said earlier is that you said trauma is cellular. I've never heard that before. And I can imagine that you and your wife literally have PhDs in what you've learned over the course of so many years. When somebody needs to advocate for someone else, that's a process, it's a journey. You have to have courage and stamina to keep going back and advocate. What have you learned about that for yourself as you continue to advocate for your son?
There have been times numerous times where I just look at my wife and we both know we have no idea what's next. We've tried to find answers. We've tried to find resources, and then a door opens.
Yeah.
And we thank God for that. And then this last time, there were no doors opening. Mm-hmm. And we're afraid. We're afraid for his life. We're afraid for our life. So it's always advocating means you need people advocating for you as parents. Mm-hmm. You're going to pour everything you can into finding answers. Mm-hmm. And eventually you're going to be empty. So we have groups beyond our individual therapists that we see. We have groups that we're a part of. We've actually gone to trauma counseling, to trauma counseling conventions. So they have, especially in the adoptive world, a lot. I mean, let's face it. If you're adopting a child, I don't care how you do it, there's trauma. Even if it's if you have someone carrying your child and biologically it's yours, there's probably going to be some kind of trauma there. Whether that's an open adoption and you know that whoever carried you, they're going to feel different from everyone else because they came into this world different from normal. Normal is a very loose word. And so there's trauma there. So you're going to be pouring all your advocacy into that child. You need to have people that are advocating for you. The way to do that is not being afraid to tell your story, not being afraid to form that team of people around you. We found an advocate early on in the social services world, and she's phenomenal. She showed up at our very first IEP meeting at the school because we were like clueless. We're clueless. We have no idea what resources are available. And so we're trying to fix that here in our county, at least, so that people know where the resources are. Because you step into this world and it's all new to you and you're a rookie, but you quickly learn. And then you get to that point where you know more than the local school and you know more than the local police department. But you're advocating for training in the school and the police department. My son is biracial, so his biological father, which we don't know who was African American. His mother was Caucasian. And so I take him to the local police department and I'm like, hey, this is my son. If you ever encounter him and there's an issue, just so you know, he has autism and mental illness and he's going to respond differently. And I want you to know him and I want you to see him because they don't have that proper training on how to deal with mental health. There are certain places in the United States that have realized that. And they're investing in not police officers, but mental health responders. And they're seeing the city of Denver, they're seeing a huge impact on the amount of work the police officers are not doing when it comes to mental health. So they're able to concentrate on the serious stuff. And these mental health workers who are trained to be able to respond in the proper way, that's needed across the country.
Thanks for explaining that, because I've heard of that on the news and I was like, what does that necessarily mean? That's so helpful. Brian, gosh, thank you so much for opening the door and letting us in for a bit just to hear your story and what you and your wife and your sons have walked through. I'm grateful to hear this because it just helps us recognize so many different areas, how God is continually working, and gosh, just where he's meeting you guys. So thank you so much for sharing that today. If people wanted to get connected to you, what are the best ways that they can do that?
So X, at Brian Utter on X.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll put all of Brian's information everywhere that you can find him, all the places he works, in today's show notes. Brian, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you.
This is such a story from Brian and his wife. Honestly, sometimes when we go through things, it is brutal and it is beautiful all at the same time. If you are in an ongoing parable story of your own, we just want to let you know that we see you. We hold space for stories like this where it is not wrapped up in a tidy bow. This is a space for stories like this to be shared. To connect with Brian, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Brian. Number 1, what are some ways that you can release the tension of holding these 2 things, these ongoing stories in your life? Number 2, isolation is very real and it is pretty easy to fall into. So what is one way you can reach out to a friend or a safe person in your life to continue to strengthen your community base for the future, for right now? Also, a huge shout out to my husband, Eric, for editing this podcast today. Yes, we met at a radio station. So this whole story really comes full circle for me when I think about Brian's work. I'm so grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God is with us in the messy and he continues to love us through it. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.